Most of these refugees were originally sponsored by Cuban-American families. Those sponsors backed out, told them they couldn't give them a place to stay, food, or help with finding jobs.
There it is, the People's Radio Station, WDNA, which stands for Dade's New Access, 88.9 on your FM dial. If you've always dreamed of being on the radio, this is where it can all come true.
My struggle for survival, I might add, did not end with that big tank with the white star. It began again. I realized that Hitler had almost programmed my destruction.
Hello, I'm Joe Abrell. The saga of the Cuban refugees continues. More than 100,000 have left their homeland this year, of course, and of those, about 70,000 are expected to settle here in Dade County. But some of the exiles who are here already have not yet found homes or jobs. Nancy Solomon has more.
It was hard not to become involved, not to get caught up in the emotional swell. Cuban refugees fleeing Castro and communism, the stories of reunions, children seeing their parents for the first time in 20 years, entire families together finally in the same city. Those were the stories with fairy tale endings. There are others that bring us back to reality. It looks like an annex to Little Havana. Everything's Latin. The sights, smells, the sounds. But unlike that prosperous city outside these gates, home to thousands of new exiles, these 700 Cuban refugees are living in the bowels of the Orange Bowl with no place else to go. They sleep on cots dug into the sand. They've staked out their own territory. Most of these refugees were originally sponsored by Cuban-American families. Those sponsors backed out, told them they couldn't give them a place to stay, food, or help with finding jobs. It seemed rather cruel to the outside world that these sponsors would at the last minute abandon the new Cuban arrivals. But in the majority of cases, this is not what happened. The Cuban refugees being processed at Fort Chaffee, Eglin Air Force Base, or Indian Gap were restless and desperate to get out.
In order to get out of those camps, they asked their friends to look for a sponsor for them. And the sponsors happened to be friends of theirs just to get them out of the camp. When they get here, they call the sponsor and say, no, we were only, this is it. We just got you out of the camp, and we don't want to give you a place to stay or food or anything else. You wanted to get out of the camp, and we got you out of the camp. I call these fake sponsors.
Besides the fake sponsors, as Odio calls them, there were families who did take in relatives and friends, only to discover they got on each other's nerves.
They were too crowded, they were too noisy, the kids were bothering the wife of the brother or whatever, and they were brought over and said, please take us in because we just can't stay there any longer.
Which is just what Francisco Vasquez did when his aunt started complaining about his smoking. It bothered her and everyone else living in her house. Vasquez would rather sleep here on a cot than give up his personal habits.
Her house is good. She don't like the smoke. Anything. I say her, I will live here. I like live here. It's difficult, but I am free.
This is not the kind of freedom Agustino Perez and his mother had in mind. Perez spent the last 15 years in Cuba as a political prisoner. A former ally and jailmate brought Perez and his mother out of Mariel, telling them they would live with him in Miami. The friend didn't know at the time his own family would be leaving Cuba.
They receive other families from Cuba too, and they must help them too. They are not rich and they are living in a little apartment.
The apartment was too small for the number of people living with Mario and Marina Giesbert. There was only one bedroom. There were 8 refugee house guests, 6 relatives of Mario's, and Agustino and his mother. Did you really feel that you had the place for them to stay and that you could help?
Sí, nosotros contábamos con que nosotros pudiéramos ayudarlo a él hasta que él se encaminara.
I want to help Agustino because when I came over, someone else helped me, giving me food and shelter. But when my family came, there were just too many people. We started hearing from neighbors that the manager was inquiring about how many people were living in this apartment. We were afraid we'd be thrown out ourselves, and we're not rich. We wouldn't have any place else to go. So Agustino and his mother left. She stayed in different people's apartment. Agustino lived in the back seat of a car. We couldn't do anything else for him.
Agustino Perez and his mother were in line when the Orange Bowl opened its gates last month to homeless Cuban refugees. Like most of his peers, Perez looks for work during the day. But he's run into a snag, a kind of catch-22. Once employers know he speaks English, they're reluctant to hire him.
They think that I am over the kind of work that I can do. And they think, of course, and I will do it, to live in a few time to better works and to better. Then it is difficult to me to find a job here in Miami.
Which is why Perez is now scouting the job market in Orlando. He thinks too many of his compatriots living in the Orange Bowl are stubborn, choosing to look for work only in the Miami area.
They want to live in Miami only. That's bad. Not a city in the world can afford that kind of trouble. Economically, can't do it.
Many of their predecessors 20 years ago were professional people. This new wave of Cuban exiles, most of the 115,000, are blue-collar workers. Cesar Odio calls them survivors. He says they were suffocated, stifled, and frustrated under Castro, and consequently became defiant.
To survive and under those conditions, to eat, they stole a cow or they steal a chicken. To hurt the government, they would not work. So that they would hurt the economy of the communist government. They became lazy. They became used to being facilitated everything by a communist regime. We have to educate them that this is a different world, that this is a different type of life.
That education would be made easier if the refugees had sponsors to guide them, to help them out economically. But since they don't, Metro and the city of Miami have provided them with food and shelter at a cost so far of $160,000. Most new exiles want permanent homes and jobs in Dade County, where residents are becoming more concerned over how they will support 70,000 new immigrants.
County and city officials are looking for a new location to house the Cuban refugees. They must leave the Orange Bowl in a couple of weeks so the stadium can be prepared for the Miami Dolphins. Life goes on. In the meantime, a job bank has been set up to try to find employment for the refugees. Do you long to be a star? Do you have a message you just have to tell the world? Well, if you're not already famous or controversial, it seems it can be pretty hard getting time on radio or television. But now there's a way, a novel concept called public access radio. Jerry Penacoli shows us what it's all about.
It's tucked away in a cluttered building in southwest Miami. You'd probably miss it if you didn't look real hard. It's almost eerie, once you do find it, walking up the dark stairway to the still unfinished second floor. But after pushing the door aside, voila, there it is, the People's Radio Station, WDNA, which stands for Dade's New Access, 88.9 on your FM dial. If you've always dreamed of being on the radio, this is where it can all come true.
We have turned it around and said the only criteria is that you should be a human being or something coming onto our station, have an idea for a program, and we'll help you develop it if you need, and we'll put you on the air.
Muy buenas noches, bienvenidos a Música para Recordar aquí en WDNA-FM.
Et faites parvenir vos adresses et suggestions. Notre numéro de téléphone, c'est le 757 48 98 et TY Club.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is your host, Marty Levitt, bringing you Freilach Time. Our program features Jewish theater songs, Hasidic Nekanim, and Israeli favorites.
Although WDNA is only into its third week, already it's broadcasting 13 non-commercial programs. Mind you, not by professionals. Instead, those that have a sincere desire to produce a radio program and $25 a week to cover the cost of an hour's worth of radio time are on the air. Like Freddie Cruz. During the day, he's a paramedic for an ambulance company. But when he puts on those headphones and sits in front of that microphone, he's a DJ. And how about Darwin Bernardin? He's a U.S. government worker with a strong feeling that the Haitian culture isn't represented enough on Miami radio. Well, he makes it come alive when he talks into that mic.
N'oubliez pas que nous avons beaucoup d'informations et des informations communautaires pour vous, bien entendu, et surtout de la musique par-dessus le marché.
And let's not forget about Marty Levitt, clarinetist, former orchestra leader, and musical arranger. He calls himself the Benny Goodman of Jewish music. He started recording in New York City more than 20 years ago, moved down here several years ago, and saw his records in stores, but heard no one playing them. So now he's playing them on WDNA.
And you're going to hear me starting the introduction on the clarinet. So let's sit back and relax. There I go. That was a little steal from George.
Right now, the radio station is on the air about 5 hours a night. That's because it's being programmed by only a handful of unpaid staffers who have to hold other full-time jobs during the day. Nonetheless, the station's got variety, from news and sports to polka music, piano music, original comedy, 3 foreign language programs, and an oldies but goodies program produced by this man, Mike Lance. Now, Mike doesn't let the fact that he is totally blind stand in the way of his strong determination to make it in the broadcasting field.
Welcome to this edition of Command Performance. This is Mike Lance, otherwise known as yours truly, the golden goodie from the nitty-gritty city. Mike Lance, I'm here to put more dips in your hips, more glide in your stride, and more cut in your strut. And if you can't dig it, you know you got a hole in your soul. Relax, and remember those good old days of rock and roll radio.
Mike has wanted to be involved with radio ever since he was 4 years old. He grew up listening to legendary DJs like Rick Shaw and Charlie Murdoch. And he studied broadcasting at Miami-Dade South with hopes of someday landing a full-time paying radio job. But he's had no luck with a number of radio stations in town, including WWOK-AM.
Over a year, and I left because I wasn't getting paid, and when the new owners took over, they claimed they couldn't pay me.
WDNA has enabled him to be on the radio, to get his career started, but still he makes no money doing it. Mike says even the Agency for the Blind hasn't been too cooperative in helping him find a paying job. He has a hard time convincing potential employers that he can do the job and would like nothing more than to just be given the chance.
I think the funnest thing for me personally would be going over to a nightclub and just spinning old rock and roll records for an hour. I would love to do that. I've never really felt handicapped. I feel pretty good. I just at times feel frustrated, but I know I can make it. And Bob, I think, has that confidence in me too.
By the way, Bob Andrews, operations manager of WDNA, is legally blind and supervises the technical end of a lot of the programs that are broadcast. Along with Mike Lance, General Manager Ray Myers has been with WDNA from the very day the idea of bringing public access radio to Miami was proposed 9 years ago. A lot of the equipment being used is his own personal equipment, and the $400 it costs to rent the building that houses the station comes out of Ray's wallet every month and will continue to until the funds needed to keep the thing going are generated. Ray says that can't be done without community support, which he says there's very little of right now.
They just don't want to shell out with the bucks, and that's what it really takes. There's only so much that a human's time can do, and then pretty soon you have to start seriously considering, well, we need this piece of equipment, we need those parts, we need to get this particular job done, and it takes money. There's no substitute for it.
So as you can see, WDNA isn't a knock-em, sock-em rock and roll radio station, but then again, it really isn't trying to be. It's an alternative, giving the Mike Lances and Marty Levitts a chance to share the airwaves. You know, I'd bet they'd even give a TV reporter a chance at it if he really wanted to. This is Jerry Penacoli coming at you, Miami. Here's one for you. Wake up, little Susie, wake up. Yeah.
Well, you know my preoccupation with history because it's the guide for the future for us. Tonight we're going to explore a more recent piece of our history which has been unpleasant for most of us in one way or another. And for many people here in South Florida, the Holocaust has had direct impact. It's the point of departure for our discussion tonight of this book by Samuel Pisar called Of Blood and Hope. Now, Mr. Pisar is concerned that we not devolve into just a discussion of the Holocaust and the horrors that it had, because it goes without saying it was a terrible time, and you yourself were at Auschwitz. And we could spend an hour with those tales of woe, but I think it's enough to be said that you were there, that you spent how many years there?
In all 4 years. I am possibly one of the youngest survivors. But the book is not a book about the Holocaust. It's an autobiographical book and an essay about the problems of today, political, economic, diplomatic. In other words, I'm trying to establish the link between my world, which had collapsed, and destroyed everything around me, my family, my school friends, my town, my people, and the possible collapse that may be ahead of us and of our children as things seem to be sliding nationally and internationally from bad to worse.
I would guess that you're an exceptional person, and that for every one of you who has ended up coming out of a concentration camp and ending up with a PhD from Harvard and Sorbonne and advising the leaders of the world as you have, there are thousands who died alongside of you. Now, why did you survive? Do you think that you are a special person?
I don't think I'm a special person, and of course the destruction around me is astounding. Let me give you one statistic. In my town, in Białystok, eastern Poland, there were 900 students in my school. I am the only survivor. Now, the reason I survived, I believe, is that it was partly luck and to some degree science. When I was thrown into the pit of hell at the age of 13, it would have either broken me or, not having broken me, it matured me very, very quickly. I learned to develop muscles, not only physical, that's the least of it, muscles of the mind, of the brain, of the nervous system. In other words, I think I managed to summon the vital forces of life. Let's call it the adrenaline of survival. And I'm saying this because I see in it a symbol. You know, when I saw that huge American tank with a white star, a vision, my first vision of freedom, and that black GI who climbed out of the hatch and picked up that skeletal kid and pulled him down into the womb of freedom, to me, that was a symbol. That was the ultimate moment of survival. But before I got to that point, I had to rise to the challenge with everything I had. And this is the kind of mentality into which people, nations and societies must put themselves in order to face the challenges and the risks and the dangers of the future.
But let's be fair now, and I'm trying to represent people. Now, the average American has no concept of hunger, of the trials and tribulations of what happened in Europe 40 years ago. America's had 200 years of insulation from those kinds of experiences. And even of all the people that it happened to, you are still, I would guess, an exception to what happened to those people.
I'm an exception because I survived and so many others have perished. But
even of those who survived, though?
Even of those survived. My struggle for survival, I might add, did not end with that big tank with a white star. It began again. I realized that Hitler had almost programmed my destruction because physically I was breathing, but that was not the happy ending. I had to remake myself. I had to accept the idea that I must study again, not having seen a school book for 6 years, not having been inside a classroom for 6 years. And there, again, it became a struggle for survival in a different context, in a different environment, to become a civilized man, to justify my survival, to undo a little particle of Hitler's work, to live out not only my life, but the lives of those who did not make it. These are the forces that were at work in my case. I would like to communicate that to many people today who are gloomy, desperate, and who want to give up. And the reason I wrote this book in the United States, not in Europe, where it became a massive bestseller, I wrote it on Cape Cod largely, in Massachusetts, because I wanted to be away from the bloody history of Europe by writing it, relate it to the United States, make Americans who have never suffered a disruptive war on their soil, who have never been overtaken by tyrants, to understand that this does relate to their lives, to their fears, and to their hopes for the future.
But let's be fair to Americans, to myself. To talk about, for me to think of of happening to my home, this station, this city, what happened in Europe is unthinkable, I guess.
This is how my parents used to reason.
Exactly.
In 1939, in 1940, as the world was collapsing. They felt some danger, but it was not palpable. And, of course, no one really did anything. If we had known, we would have taken our destiny in our own hands. We would not have delegated our survival to some politicians or to some economists or God knows what. Survival begins at home. Maybe my father would have picked up his family and said, let's go and join our relatives in the United States. They did not do it. They were reasoning the way you have just described it, and that is a tremendous danger. We must understand that we are involved, people are involved, and the problems are challenging and disturbing and overwhelming indeed, but human beings have an infinite capacity to rise to a challenge, and the human spirit must be made to work. It is not something that does not concern us. No one will pull us out of it if we don't join that process.
And I struggle every day with how to make people truly believe the things you're saying. You have the same problem. You've written the book. You want people to really understand. But they say, well, of course he feels that way. It happened to him, but it's never happened to me or
Well,
my
that's
grandfather
it,
or my great-grandparents.
This is why I did not want to write this book like the Harvard intellectual. You know, it's not my first book. I've written other books on economic and political subjects, and I've decided it's irrelevant. I wanted to write this book and show in the colors of flesh and blood how a family, middle-class family, a happy family, in a peaceful, cultured, prosperous town, one summer day finds itself in surroundings where everything is falling apart. The economy, the political system, the social system, there is violence in the streets, and an inevitable, inexorable process of destruction sets in that leads to a pilot project almost for the destruction of humanity. And I want them to feel it through, I want them to be acquainted, I didn't think I could bring myself to say it, with my mother as a human being, a beautiful young woman who had one day to ask herself the kind of question that a mother is normally doesn't have to ask itself. Am I going to put long pants on this boy or short pants? Maybe if I put long pants on him, they will take him for a man and he will work and they will let him survive. I am condemned. His little sister, who's 8 years old, is condemned. And this is the way it was. She packed my little suitcase as if she was sending me off to summer camp. And yet she knew, I don't know how, that she was condemned to the gas chamber, with the old, with the sick, with all those that were not useful. And that was my first lease on life. And this is not an abstract story I'm telling you. I'm telling you a story of human existence and all the survival that came later. And I am not telling you, in speaking about contemporary problems, a Boy Scout theory. I am telling you that survival, hope, is possible, is necessary, if we are to build a future worthy of free man. Otherwise, what will happen could conceivably happen in a way similar to the way it happened only 35, only 40 years ago.
I believe you. I just hope that 500,000 people watching understand and believe that it indeed can happen, and the way it will happen is if we assume that it can't happen. Then it really has a potential of occurring to us all. And Samuel Pisar, thank you again. Let me show them the cover of this book, Of Blood and Hope. And I recommend that you read it so that we become slightly more aware of what the potential can be if we don't think it can be. Thank you very much, Mr. Pisar. We'll be right back. Is there one single name in rock and roll that's most closely identified with Miami? Casey and the Sunshine Band? The Bee Gees, maybe? Well, if you ask people in the rock business, who's Mr. Miami, you'll hear a name you might not have thought about, Wayne Cochran. Next week on Montage, we'll show you the still exciting star who rose to fame singing Going Back to Miami. And I'll talk with Thomas Merton. Now, he was the role model for the part Robert Redford played in his new movie, Brubaker, and he has some amazing things to say about prison reform. He's truly worth a listen. That's our montage for this week. I'm Joe Abrell.